to Deep Conversations and Explorations. For a seventh episode on biology, we sat down with Dr. Arvid Ågren. Dr. Ågren is an evolutionary biologist and a Wenner-Gren Fellow at the Evolutionary Biology Centre at Uppsala University. His research focuses on genetic conflicts, and he has published widely on their biology and implications for evolutionary theory. He also works on foundations of the selfish gene theory and is the author of The Gene's Eye View of Evolution. He holds degrees from the universities of Edinburgh and Toronto, and prior to joining Uppsala, he was a postdoc at Cornell and Harvard. We talked about what is biology, what is a gene's eye view of evolution, what makes biology and evolutionary biology exciting, how biology approaches the bigger questions, conflict and cooperation as per a biologist, difference between aggression and conflict, the goal of evolution, what we can learn from nature, and also what gene can tell us about free will. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans, as well as all other living beings. Hello, Professor Ågren. Welcome to Deep.
Thank you for having me.
We're very happy to have you, and we've prepared a bunch of questions for you. And generally, I'd like to get started with the most basic, seemingly the most obvious question, but I think it's important that we understand it. So my first question to you is, what is biology, and what has been your own approach to the subject?
So biology is the study of life. And I think biology occupies a rather unique, but what I think is the most fascinating part of science. So biology is concerned with living things, entities that are alive. And of course, we know that these living things are made of the same particles like anything else. They obey the same laws of physics like anything else. But also, anyone who's looked at a plant or at an animal know that these things are quite different than a rock or compared to a wave or something. And it is in that kind of uniqueness, that's kind of what biologists are interested in. And in particular, as evolutionary biologists, which is the branch of biology that I've come from, we were interested in kind of why organisms are the way they are, and kind of why they are so different, and often why they are so well suited for the environment in which they live. And you can go about study this in many ways. People study this in the lab, people go out into nature to observe them or to set up experiments. I've often come to it from a more theoretical point of view. I've often been interested in the kind of the nature of the explanations that we come up with, and to develop kind of general models of evolution. And in particular, I've been interested in kind of puzzles of evolution, things that kind of initially don't really make sense from the kind of traditional theories of evolution by natural selection. So I've been interested in problems often related to social evolution, why organisms cooperate with each other, and indeed why the parts of the body cooperate with each other so well that they do.
Yeah, and for an everyday person, these are things we end up taking for granted, conflict or cooperation, both. So I have read your website. I mean, I've gone through your website. I have read some of the work and most of your interviews. So we will get into that. But I think there's one more what is question before we get on to more detailed questions. I'd like to understand from you, what is a gene?
That is one of those questions that both biologists and philosophers of biology have debated a lot. And is also, despite being such a common term, and playing such an important role, particularly in the way we talk about biology to a larger and kind of in larger societal conversations, it is also one of those things that you can define in many different ways, depending on what you kind of want the concept to do for you. So on some level, a gene is a DNA sequence that has a certain kind of start and an end. And this is usually how we use the word when we talk about that we're interested in the genetic basis or the genetic architecture of a specific trait. So for example, when we say that if you carry the BRCA1 gene, when you carry the BRCA1, if you have this one version of the gene, you have an increased risk of getting breast cancer. Then it's a kind of quite clearly delineated from this part of the DNA sequence that starts here and ends here. Mm-hmm. In other parts of biology, we use gene to mean something much more abstract. So in my part of biology, in population genetics, where we develop mathematical models to describe how a genes increases or decreases in frequency in a population over time. There, in order to make those models, you don't have to specify exactly what the material basis of the gene is. You think of it just as something that's stably inherited from one generation to another. And here it's much more abstract. You don't really need to specify what it is really. So different biologists use it in different ways, but I think the most conventional way to use it is that it is a DNA sequence that has some sort of a function in an organism, often, but not always, to produce a protein.
And the word itself, is it in some sense a short form of generation?
I don't think, oh, that's a good question. I don't know if the etymology of it, if it has the same root, gene and generation, that I don't know, actually. That's an interesting question.
If it was, would it make sense?
It could do it in a way, I guess. I mean, so as evolutionary biologists, we're often interested in how genes become common or rare over time, and time we usually measure in generations. So there's a connection there. But I don't dare to speculate on the origins of it, but that's a fun question.
Okay. So would you say that when a biologist like yourself is studying genetics, that in some sense makes you a historian?
I think so. I think evolutionary biology is a historical science. It's one of those sciences that try to make inferences about what happened in the past by looking at what we can see now. And that's partly what makes it difficult. It's hard to make understand things that happened a really long time ago, and especially because the evolutionary timescales are so enormous. You know, because you're dealing with numbers that, like, you know, oh, this is 1 million or 10 millions or 100 millions of years ago, and to me, those numbers just becomes numbers, right? I think you can develop a bit of a better kind of intuition for it, but still, I mean, I have a very hard time kind of imagining, if it's someone to tell you, imagine 10,000 soccer balls or 100,000 or 100 million. It kind of just looks like the same to me, and I think that's the same for time. Like going back in time, it can be really hard. But it's very much what evolutionary biology is about, and I will argue all of biology is about, because all biology is about understanding living organisms. So these organisms have an evolutionary past. They are a product with a long history that has shaped them. The reason why organisms and all of life look the way they do is because of their evolutionary history.
Right.
So that's why I think biology in general, but evolutionary biology in particular, is very much a historical science. So I guess it makes you kind of a historian of life in that way, of all of life.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That makes sense. So about your book, which is Gene's Eye View of Evolution, can you tell us what the Gene's Eye View tells us about evolution, and what are some of the other ways that evolution is and can be studied from the apart from the point of view of the gene, that can, when the regular man is listening to this conversation, that they can draw something of value from it?
So the Gene's Eye View of Evolution is a way of thinking about evolution and about natural selection. It takes a starting point that while in a day-to-day, what is happening is that individual organisms are interacting with each other. There's individuals that live and die. There's individuals that vary in how good they are at reproducing. And this is kind of the way how Darwin originally thought about the theory. It's a theory about individual organisms. And the Gene's Eye View kind of recognizes that is kind of what's going on. But then he points out that when you then go from one generation to the next, when one generation dies and the other one starts living, the one thing that is transmitted from the one generation to the next are genes or genetic material. So that's why you can think of genes kind of marching through generations, as every time all these things happen in one generation, but the one thing that's passed on are the genes. So the Gene's Eye View takes this insight very seriously and argues that as a consequence of that, we are better off thinking about evolution and natural selection from the perspective of genes. And so that like a lot of things become more easy to think of evolution as a kind of competition between genes across generations, and organisms are these kind of temporary homes that genes have as they kind of make their way through generations. And this has been why I thought it's interesting, the debate about the genes view, and it has been quite an intense debate among biologists for the past 50 years or so about is this a good way of thinking or not? And it's really good to make sense of certain kind of phenomena that are hard to think about from the perspective of individuals. The kind of main alternative to that is saying, well, sure, genes are passed on, but you're kind of missing the point. The point is that there are individual organisms. Those are the ones that are doing things. It is the individual organisms that are interacting with each other. They are the ones that live and die. They are the ones that reproduce. So that's what we should think about evolution in terms of that. That it happens that inheritance is passed on through this, what we now call genes. Yeah, that is a good way of kind of keeping a record of what is happening, and that you can kind of use it as an accounting method in a sense, because you can kind of track evolutionary change at the genetic level. But then the argument would be, that does not mean that we should always think in terms of genes. It is individuals that do things, and that's why we should think about it in that way. And that has often been, I think, one of the stronger arguments against it.
Yeah, like, so if I have to just bring in common sense, because really that's all I can bring in, and I could be wrong there as well. But let's see how it goes. So you've got the gene inside you, and we're talking about studying evolution from the point of view of the gene. And you're saying that the best counter argument to that is that as carriers of that gene, as the host, right? We're alive. And we're not, it seems, not just made up of the gene alone, we're made up of many factors, internally and externally. So as we interact with each other, as we interact with the environment, now what I'd like to know from you is, this interaction, is it going to affect the genetic code? Is it going to affect the genetic code that we had inherited from our parents? And perhaps, I don't know if you've heard this phrase called me against myself. Have you heard this phrase ever? Me against myself.
I don't think so.
So there are lyrics, there are people who talk, I'm always, I'm always against myself. Like, we're talking about internal conflict. I'd like to do something, but I end up doing something else. Sometimes we say, I don't even know why I did it. And I'm not talking about when I say I don't know why I did it as a cop-out, but sometimes you really do not understand why you behave that way. Maybe you set out to do something and you ended up doing something completely else. And you understand that that's you who's doing it, but you can't justify it even to yourself, even though it's coming from within you. So what I want to know is that this interaction with the environment and with our culture, which is so much changing all the time. I'm not just talking about natural environment where the seasons change, but our social environment is also going through some kind of a intense transformation. What kind of an effect does that have on the gene, if any study has been done on it? And does it also show that the gene has the ability to then adapt to these changes, because its purpose is to be passed on? It will only be passed on when the host manages to survive and procreate. So does it also adapt? And does that adaptation on the part of the gene show any form of intelligence in the gene?
So there's a couple of things to unpack here. The fact that we and all organisms, we should say, I think are a product of the genes that we inherited, the environment that we live in, and the interaction between the two. And that interaction can also be quite complex, so that a specific genotype, so the genes that we inherited, can lead to quite different phenotypes, so the kind of outward manifestation of it, kind of how the organism looked, depending on the environment in which it is. And this is kind of a big topic that people study. They're interested in what is known as plasticity. So like how the same genotype can lead to different phenotypes depending on which environment that is in, and understanding that kind of genes by environment interaction. Now, in all of these cases, the genetic code remains the same. It's just that it's kind of how those genes are expressed depend on the environment that they are in. So like we also think that plasticity in of itself, the ability for a set of genes to kind of have a different expression or manifestation depending on the environment, that on some way is also under genetic control, but understanding how that works is hard, and I'm not fully up to date on exactly on those details, but it highlights something that, it's not necessarily that the genetic code changes for it to have different expressions in different environments. You can kind of do so and still kind of remain the same. A second thing is that the genetic code can change in response to environment. That is rarely in the kind of, or it's not really kind of used by social interactions or that the weather is bad, but things like radiations following nuclear accidents, kind of extreme high levels of radiation can lead to many more mutations happening in the genome. So that's here in Scandinavia, which is quite close to Chernobyl, when that nuclear accident happened, people could study that. People have studied that in, I think, currently studied that in areas near Fukushima in Japan. And there you will say, so there's an environment that has changed, and that leads to changes in the genetic code. But it's kind of an extreme form of it, right? That is not really what normally happens. And when it comes to kind of genes wanting to adapt, now, so I'm quite fond of the genes I view as a heuristic, a good way of thinking about evolution by natural selection. Mm-hmm. And in this way, you often think of, like, if I was a gene, what would I do? And then you put yourself in the shoes of a gene, and you try to think through different situations. In all of these cases, however, we are doing so in this kind of as-if way. So I think it's, these genes are used, they don't want anything. They're completely inert in that way. But it's a very powerful way of thinking about them as if they did. And this kind of, what can we call a heuristic of personification, like putting yourself in the shoes of that, it turns out to be a very helpful way of thinking. But it is a helpful way of thinking, even if they don't have any intelligence or desires or wants. It's just that it's a useful way of thinking as if they did.
When it is inert, though, and we are trying to think by stepping into its shoes, but we're also saying that there is genetic control, but it is inert. So how do we reconcile this?
And that there is genetic control of phenotypes or of certain traits.
Like you were saying earlier, that yes, the genes gets influenced by the environment that the host body is in. There is an influence, but still it's ultimately under the control of the gene. Isn't that what you said? No, but but the thing itself is inert. But then it seems it's also alive. Does it have intelligence? Like, how is this happening? It's so complicated to understand this.
It is. Yeah, and I think a lot of the traits that we or the kind of parts of an organism that we see, they're going to vary in how much they're kind of under the sole kind of course of control, if you will, of genes, or how much they are affected by the environment, and how much is very environmental. So certain things will kind of almost is kind of regardless of what way you grow up, the gene will have the same effects, and for certain things it's going to vary much more. Now, of course, genes are part of living things. So like an organism is clearly alive, and you can take out a cell or a couple of cells, and they will also be alive. But they're also, we're made of non-living things. Right? We're made of the same carbon molecules that make up the table or the chair that we are sitting at. But in that configuration, it's not alive, but in the configuration that we have in our body, they are. And I guess that is kind of the question of how does that happen? But I mean, I think the fact that it is, I think that mystery is fascinating, but I think it becomes even more fascinating just for the exact same, for that very fact that we are made of the same, fermions and bosons like anything else. But when you put them together in this way, we are alive, and we have all of this and the whole natural world. And that's the same thing those atoms were spewed out of a star that exploded millions of years ago, and like now they're together like this, and they're like yeah, that just adds to the fascination, I think.
Exactly. And we've spoken to like physicists. The series that we concluded just now was a series with a number of physicists, and they are saying this, that ultimately the origin of things was very simple. For physics, it is those four basic forces, and then the complexity built up, and which is where I think unpredictability, or whatever you want to call it, came into the picture, because the interactions were leading to more interactions, leading to more forms, leading to all kinds of things. So that seems to be the case. Like the interaction seems to be the essence of, it seems to be at the essence of physics. I don't know if it is at the essence of maths, but would you say it is also at the essence of biology, interaction of the thing with itself and with external whatever?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And I mean, in the same way, like, and I think those interactions, that at some level, those interactions become so hard that the classic tools of physics don't work anymore. And that's why we need, nothing in biology breaks the laws of physics. Of course, it's completely compatible with what physicists know. But we also find that talking in terms of quarks or the four forces, fundamental forces, it's not a very necessarily useful way all the time to talk about organisms, right? So we have this other kind of vocabulary, other ways of kind of explanatory models when it comes to biology. But as you say, interaction is at the heart of those, and perhaps even more so in biology, which is all about it. And a multicellular organism is this complex, interactions of millions of cells that coordinate their activities. Each cell containing thousands of genes. Not to mention that we have something like as many bacterial cells living inside of us that interact with each other, interact with us, and they play an important role in our health and fitness. And then you can zoom out again and like how different species interact with each other in ecosystems, and eventually kind of all of these interactions within organisms, between members of the same species, between members of different species. It's the very engine that is the source of all the diversity and kind of the diverse forms of life that we see it, as it's the heart of evolution by natural selection, which is the source of it all.
Exactly. What you just said is what was going on in my mind. So when the first human beings, and inside them, they carried the genes, they carried cells, they carried all things that make up the bio form, the life. As they migrated, their interaction most drastically changed with their external environment, because maybe from mountainous, maybe to plains, to maybe near rivers, to maybe near somewhere where there were thick green forests. So that led to diversity, is it? Because originally it must have been the same, and then it diversified. So am I right in saying that?
I mean, yeah, on some level, that like an environment that always stays the same, there's we don't expect much the diversity to happen among organisms. And I mean also kind of tie into kind of like how deep these kind of interactions run, right? Is that you can very much think like life is organized in these layers of cooperation.
Yeah. That
you have genes working together in genomes. In each eukaryotic cell, like a human cell, you have genes in more than one location, where in the nuclear genome and then mitochondrial genome. And that kind of arrangement that we have it in two is the product of the coming together of two different kinds of species, and that became one in a symbiotic event 1.5 billion years ago or so. And then you have cells working together in organisms working together in complex groups and societies, and at all of these levels, where it's from cell to society, if you will, you have kind of these social interactions are at the very heart of it, and at all levels cooperation must win over conflict, over selfish behavior. So I think it's like this kind of like interaction, because social interactions lie at the very kind of core of what life is. Yeah, so as it is organized.
Right. It's interesting. Even in the nature of conversation, Dr. Ågren, what I see is I prepare a bunch of questions, and I'm sure the guest who's coming in is also coming in with some kind of a mindset of no expectations, because we're such a new channel, we're still setting out our tone, we're still setting out our goals. So they come in, out of the goodwill of their heart, and, also to talk about their subject. And then the conversation happens, which seems to carry, it generates a life of its own. So like I see it all the time. Like I've prepared some 25 questions for you, and I was hoping to get through all of them. But as we talk, something else clicks, and in my mind, it interacts with something else. So, it's like saying, when we speak with physicists, here are some of the words that they commonly use. They use the word interaction. The mathematicians use the word organization and arrangement. And these are some of the words you used. And in life, we use these words. So there seems to be something very fundamentally common, not different, in all the fields that we are choosing to study life from. Would you say that biology is basically a way to understand what this whole thing is about and who we are, not just from a biological perspective? It is a biological perspective, but it is answering a much bigger question than perhaps we think it is.
I think so. I mean, I always thought what makes biology in general and evolutionary biology in particular so exciting is that it is a science that try to make sense of often quite specific details about how a fruit fly works, or why this plant lives longer than the other. But it's also it's kind of this invitation to think about bigger questions. To say, why are we here? Where did we come from? How do we as a species fit together with everything, all other life on this planet? So it has this almost it leads to this invitation to reflect upon bigger, often quite questions that have often been tackled by in philosophical or religious traditions. And some of my colleagues find that frustrating, but I always found that very exciting, that you are dealing with things that touches you very deeply. And I think the theory of evolution is one of those scientific theories, because it's hard to be unmoved by it when you learn that this is kind of how we and all other life came to look the way it does. I do find it's harder to just look at life in the same way after you've learned that, in the same that there's certain things as exciting as they are when you learn things in chemistry, and you go it's cool and it's exciting, but also life goes on in the same way, I find, whereas like a lot of this kind of in biology, it gets you in a different way, and that I always found so very exciting about it, and to get to study it.
I understand. And there is something that we do as human beings, right? When we try to take things apart, like you're a young kid and you take apart what this little toy truck you have, you take it apart and you try to put it back together to see how it works. And if you put it back, can you make some changes, or will you be able to put it back to the way it was? So this, as we understand things, and then we try to create, let's say, certain kind of a machine based on our understanding of a natural phenomena that occurs naturally in nature. Do you think that in some sense, this thing that we create, it could be in the form of an idea, it could be in the form of a quotation, equation, notation. If we understand something, how it works, then we try to simulate it. And once we try to simulate it, we think we can now control it. And then it becomes more about control, less about understanding. Am I philosophically on point, or am I just maybe a little confused in what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way of thinking. I mean, I think in parts of science, like breaking things apart to see how they work, is very common. I think that is true of a lot of science. As you say, whether it's the kid who breaks apart her toy to put it back together again, or the engineer who when they set off start by taking apart a radio only to build it back again. And in some ways we try to do that in biology as well, like a common way to understand what the effect of different genes are is that you create a mutation in them and pretty much just see what happens. So if you mutate this part of the gene, what happens? If you mutate this part of the gene, what happens? So people you often study this in fruit flies or in mice or in nematode worms, something that you can kind of keep under very kind of controlled environments, and then you systematically change one thing at a time, pretty much just see what happens. It's a bit of a fishing expedition because you don't know if anything will change at all. And sometimes it doesn't. It's just like you can change this part of the gene and you're fine. But then you realize, well, when you change this part of the gene, you have a very drastic difference in phenotype. And that is, you don't kind of break apart the whole fly and put it back together, but you break a small part of it and see what happens. So I think it's kind of like the general spirit by understanding how it breaks, and then how you can put it back together, or how you can kind of like fix it again, is kind of something that runs through a lot of science, and it is a very powerful method indeed, I think, to do science.
Yeah, it's so awe-inspiring, like to be so close to understanding how nature functions, even one part at a time. It's really mind-boggling. Now, earlier you were talking about conflicts and cooperation, and how, in fact, I have one of your quotes here. I actually remember what it was. I'm not able to find it here. You said something like the use of something called enforcement, a mechanism called enforcement, which shows, which is a good way to let cooperation trump selfish behavior. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now,
yeah, so,
what I have 3 questions here, and I want just to get to the basics. Like, what do you mean by enforcement? How does a biologist define conflict, and how does a biologist define cooperation?
So, and enforcement we define here as just any mechanism that suppresses selfish behavior, and by doing that, it promotes promotes the presence of cooperation. So it allows cooperation to thrive. Now, cooperation can be defined in different ways. It's usually a social behavior that is beneficial to the at least to the recipient of the behavior. So a kind of interaction between, say, 2 individuals, and then if one of them benefits, that can often be thought of as a cooperative interaction. Some biologists want to define it as like it comes with a cost to the one performing it, but I think you can also include is the kind of mutually beneficial interactions can count as cooperation, I think. And conflict then is kind of when you have a difference in fitness interests. So you can kind of, if you think of 2 individuals that are interacting, and something that can be good for one individual but bad for the other, then they are going to be in conflict over kind of what should happen. And again, you can kind of have kind of a really broad definition of conflict that kind of includes everything from that, a predator and a prey, a cheetah and an impala are in conflict of what ought to happen. That's a very broad definition of it, because they wish that this outcome should be different. You often use it for example, conflict between 2 individuals over a resource. So two polar bears fighting over a patch of land, or 2 stags fighting over who should get to be the dominant male and get to mate. When we talk about genetic conflicts, so conflict between genes, we often mean it in the sense that there are these kind of rules, usually how genes are inherited or transmitted. So we humans, like many other species, have 2 copies of each gene. We get one from our father and one from our mother, and they work them together inside of us. But if we have kids, or then only one of them can be passed on, because the other one's going to come from the other parent. So then, but which one, right? And the way that this kind of evolution has solved this is that it's a lottery. This is meiosis. So like the way the cell division, when you produce gametes or sex cells, sperms and eggs, there's a 50% chance of each of these 2 copies being passed on. Genetic conflict can arise when there are genes that try to cheat that system, so try to end up in more than 50% of the sex cells. So and this can happen in kind of almost in so many different kinds of ways. So ones that are can damage other sperm cells that have the other copy, for example. So they pass on. There are ones that are like, when during female meiosis, so when you produce a production of eggs in humans, you produce a number of cells, only one of which develop into the actual eggs, and the other one are kind of like supporting cells.
Yeah.
But they all have genes in them. So then there's this kind of competition of which copy ends up in the one that kind of develop into the egg, and which one end up in the supporting cells that are eventually discarded. That's another kind of arena. And then there are all these kind of different ways that genes can kind of hijack the system. Pretty much every part, when genes get copied, when they get transmitted, can be hijacked. And for those kind of phenomena, we tend to use that those genes are in conflict with each other, and that also the genes that have the way of promoting their own transmission at the expense of other genes, and sometimes even at the expense of the kind of overall fitness of the organism. There are examples where you have this one that can interfere with meiosis, end up in more of the gametes, and the offspring ends up having fewer offspring, but this specific allele is overrepresented in those, so it can still spread. So there we also use them, we call those selfish genetic elements, and we describe them as behaving selfishly. Again, like there's no intentions, there are no kind of designs, but their behavior fits that kind of classic evolutionary definition that it has a benefit to their own fitness at the expense of another entity's fitness, which is kind of the classic definition of it.
This is really insane. So now I know we're not talking about genes having emotions or anything, and they're emotionally inert. Say they don't seem to be inert otherwise. You see how they don't have human emotions. Got it.
Yeah.
But here, so the gene that leads, that trumps over the others, do you think then the ones that kind of accept the leadership of this royalty gene, they're being altruistic, that they submit, and then in order for them to survive, because they accept that this gene is stronger or something, and that we are not going to have a way, but we'd like to live, so let's go down the hierarchy chain, but we continue to live. We might not be the main ones in the progeny, but we won't die altogether.
And there's something to be said also here, the way we use the word selfish here, which is somewhat confusing. So because we so in Richard Ågren's book, the Selfish Gene, which was published in 1976, and it was the kind of first time that the gene side view was popularized and reached a larger audience. And here he introduces the idea that is think in terms of genes competing for representation in coming generations. It's a powerful way to think about evolution. And in this way of talking, kind of all genes are expected to behave selfishly because they behave as if they kind of want to get into the next generation. But then it turns out also the best way to kind of fulfill that selfish goal is to build organisms to work together. But then, so there we use selfish in a slightly different way than when for these kind of selfish genetic elements that have like that kind of are cheating or almost behave as parasites and kind of cheat the system. So somewhat unfortunately, we use selfish in both those ways, but it means slightly different things. I should say so one kind of about behaving altruistically, or kind of that only certain genes get transmitted, but most of the time genes still work together. And here I think the way that meiosis, the kind of cell division that produces sex cells, that it works the way it does, that like it's essentially a lottery which of the two copies gets passed on, is a really good way of resolving the potential conflict, because a gene has no information up until that very last moment whether it's going to get passed on or not. So it's always going to be in the gene's interest most of the time just to kind of make the body work as well as it does. And this is not true only of genes. Also at the cellular level, all cells in our body are genetically identical. So whether you are a cell located in the liver or in the heart or in the brain, you share the same exact genetic information. And when that happens, we expect those cells to cooperate really well. And that is also then kind of what breaks down in things like cancer, when you have mutations, which means that those cells are no longer genetically identical to all the all the others, and therefore may behave proliferating on their own at the expense of other genes, of other cells, I should say. So kind of the kind of cooperation is at the very heart of it. The way organisms or bodies work, but then you need to have various ways of ensuring that cooperation thrives. So, and this kind of in a way ties back to the previous question about enforcement. So I've kind of been interested in kind of like, what do different kind of levels of cooperation have in common? So we can say that, you know, genes need to cooperate, cells need to cooperate, individual organisms need to cooperate. But what do they have in common? Well, on one level, not a lot, right? Because a gene is very different from an organism, that's very different from a cell. But then you start to see that there's certain things that they have in common. So you take multicellular organisms that have millions of cells working together. They work together because they're genetically identical. So that's like that they're related to each other. It's a very good way of achieving cooperation. And then you look at the most kind of extraordinary forms of cooperation in the animal world, and you see that in ants and wasps, where you have these kind of sterile workers, so individuals that can't reproduce on their own, but they devote their whole life to making other individuals, usually the queen, reproduce. Also there, you have very high degrees of relatedness. It's not 100% as it is between cells, but it's very high. So this kind of points to the importance of high degrees of relatedness. But relatedness can't be the whole answer, because they also have a lot of kind of cooperation between non-relatives. And this is where we think this kind of concept of enforcement becomes important. That kind of, if you take all examples of cooperation from the kind of molecular genes and genomes, or multiple genomes within the same cell, cells working together, organisms working together, or even members of different species working together, like in a plant and a pollinator that coordinate extractively. If you line them all up, all of them have these kind of enforcement mechanisms in place. They look quite different, but all of them have ways of preventing selfish behavior from becoming too prevalent.
Okay, so it's okay. So is what you're saying this, that say, for example, a gene or a cell, and so it is, it has whatever properties, and it wants to thrive. Each cell, each gene wants to thrive, but it also has some aware, I don't know what the right word is, but it also knows that for it to thrive, others must thrive as well. So the cooperation becomes practical that way, that if others thrive, it thrives. If thrives, others thrive. Is that one way of looking at what's going on?
Yeah, so I think in order for cooperation to evolve, you need to be some benefit to cooperating, and often that it can be that like you can achieve more together than what you can do on your own. I think that's kind of a principle that runs through a lot of it. Now, the problem often becomes then, like, if you're in a group and you could achieve more together than you could on your own, the problem is often that one individual could achieve the most if everyone else cooperated, and you just tagged along and you just like reap the rewards of everyone else's cooperation without putting in the effort or the resources needed. You don't do your fair share. So this is what are also known as cheaters, simply. And this kind of becomes the existence of these kind of cheaters is a problem in all sort of cooperative systems. And again, I think that's why we need some sort of these kind of enforcement mechanisms to identify and control cheaters, preventing them from becoming the most common strategy.
Yeah. Then I think we'll be staying on point, but maybe looking at it differently. From your website, I've picked up another quote. You said the so-called paradox of the organism. This is the fact that despite the opportunity for agents like selfish genetic elements and cancer cells, for instance, to erode the organism from within, they usually do not. But why not? You ask this question, and actually that's where it's left. And it's so interesting. It's like saying that everything can go wrong at any time, but it doesn't, at least not at all times. The system doesn't constantly keep on breaking apart and then building up and then breaking apart, and like it goes on. And of course there are times when things don't work out. So would you say that the fact that things should work out is the idea that evolution actually favors?
The question becomes, so the paradox in organisms is as you say, it comes back to this observation that there are all these opportunities for tears, where there are self-linked elements with cancer cells to proliferate. And sometimes those selfish entities win out and the organism dies or go extinct. But a lot of time you have all these kind of conflicts that go on inside of us. But it's, at the same time, when you look outside, you see well-functioning, cohesive organisms.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the mechanisms that are in place? So we're kind of interested in trying to figure out what are the kind of specific kinds of enforcement, how did they evolve, what do they have in common at different kinds of levels, and why is it that life could have occurred in so many different forms? Mm-hmm. Why is it that it takes the form of these kind of integrated, quite complex organismal form that are this kind of part of quite intricate cooperation? Why isn't it just like individual replicating genes floating around in a soup? Why is it that you have these kind of complex forms of life? And that's kind of where the paradox comes in. Trying to understand why doesn't it? Because there's been a lot of attention paid to trying to understand how it was kind of built in the first place, but we're kind of also interested in why doesn't it break apart, right, given the opportunities that exist for it to do so.
So would you say that it's that's the question, and physicists are also trying to understand why there is something rather than nothing. Why is there anything at all? And biology is saying, why is it this way? Why is it this way? Why is it compact and there's this everything like contained within it? We don't have, we're not leaking constantly like blood out of our body. It's contained within us. So now it's this sustenance, and then there are challenges to the sustenance. This seems to be the game, right? The game of life. Here is life. Here are the challenges, and the life itself would want to sustain itself. And the challenges will try to maybe make it evolve, make it get better, make it get stronger.
Yeah, in some ways, it's kind of at the heart of the principle of evolution by natural selection, that you have certain life is organized in many different ways, and there's variation in certain ways work better than others, and they tend to survive. And if those ways are heritable, then they will become more common over time. And from as Darwin wrote, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful. And like from quite simple principles, you can get this kind of principle, as you say, of that you have these kind of environmental challenges. Certain forms of life are better at meeting those challenges, and those forms then become more common over time. If you give it long enough, you can observe the kind of diversity that we see today.
Right. So we spoke to one physicist author. His name is Mr. Tom Campbell. Have you ever heard of Tom Campbell?
I don't think so, I'm afraid.
He wrote this book, a trilogy. It's called My Big Theory of Everything, My Big Toe. Okay, so we spoke to him, and his whole goal is to basically reconcile, and he says that he has, through his work, he's reconciled quantum mechanics and relativity. And what he's saying is that consciousness and evolution are the fundamental basis on which all of existence is built. That's what he says. And then he says that, yes, evolution also has a goal. For our conversation, we'll focus on evolution. He says evolution has a goal. So I asked him, what do you think is the goal of evolution? He says it very simply. He says it's to lower entropy. Do you think that evolution has a goal? I'm not talking about direction, because earlier I used to ask, does evolution have a direction? I don't know. But does it have a goal?
No, I don't think so. I think evolution just is. I think it just is a process that happens, and we can study the outcomes of it. But I think there's no goal, there's no overall purpose to it. which is, I think, a good evidence for why it does not have a goal, is that natural selection does not have any foresight. It can only act on what is present. It can't anticipate the future, which means that sometimes natural selection leads to quite ineffective forms of kind of quite bad design. Like we can look at living organisms are these kind of really complex and fantastically well suited for the environment to live in, but there are examples of really bad ones. Whether it's the blind spot in the human eye, or the way that the giraffes, the very inefficient way that giraffes transport food from their mouth to their stomach, up and down their very long neck, and so on. So there's all these kind of examples of kind of bad design, which I think is a consequence of just like there is no foresight, there's no goal, and is also a tremendously wasteful process in many ways. Natural selection, there's a lot of death and suffering and cruelty involved. So all this, I don't think that there's any overarching goal to it.
So,
I think it can be.
Yeah. So right now, this is where we are. You and I, we are able to communicate like this, and human beings have evolved. In some people will also say in some cases devolved, but let's say this is where we are. This is what we have, and this is what biologists are working with. But what you're saying is this is not the best, not the worst of what it could have been. It just is what it is, and wherever we are going from here, we are going there. We do not know where, but then what gives us guidance? What are our what are the parameters of our movement at all? Like there seem to be some underlying principles in nature. What about human beings? Is that what we are missing? Are we missing principles?
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from how nature and how the universe works. Though I think, of course, just because things are a certain way, it doesn't mean that they ought or have to be that way. And I think the guidance that we can get comes from conversations like this, and conversation with others, and kind of reflecting upon what kind of life we want to live. But I don't think they are given to us by anything bigger than that. That it is up to us to create the world we want to live in, and we do our best, and we learn from what worked and what didn't work in the past, and we try to improve on that. But I don't think that evolution or anything else is in charge or is the source of that. Okay.
So now, from your own experience, if you had to impart some insights, one thing you've already said, that cooperation, it is from what you have learned. It's not just something you're saying. It's what nature has taught you through your study of biology, that cooperation seems to be better than conflict, right? Yes. That's an insight. Are there any other insights that we can take on in our own personal lives from what you've learned from nature, how it functions, some of its principles, some of the things that it does, that could be beneficial for us?
Well, maybe when you study life or study biology for a living, it never ceases to surprise you, and I think that's true of life as well. And often it doesn't turn out as you thought it would be, but that this alternative can often be way more exciting than if it had gone to plan. I think that's true in science, and I think that's true in life.
Interesting. Okay. So there's something I wanted to ask you about conflict. Is it okay if I replace the word conflict with aggression? Not really, right?
So I think that's slightly different. Aggression, I think, refers to a behavior, and you can describe behaviors in that way. I think conflict is easier to define just in terms of fitness and so on, and different fitness interests. Whereas aggression, I think, can be part of conflict, but I don't think they're not synonymous.
Okay, so we humans have conflicts with each other's, in the families, with our neighbors, sometimes with friends, at a bigger level, global level, political level. What is the origin of this? Like, why? It's such a broad question and such a difficult question, and I hate to do this to you, but is there something that you can tell us about why it is the way it is, that conflict continues to exist?
That's
Why?
a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have a better. I don't think I would be better than anyone else to formulate an answer that would matter. I mean, I could come up with something about the evolutionary origins of conflict and how humans, like any other organisms, need access to resources and so on. But I mean, I think that I don't know how helpful that would be in really trying to understand the kinds of conflicts that matter in the world, which are often, I think, about much more immediate and historical resources that I think evolutionary or biology could probably help at understand. And I think it's not like certain conflicts are because of the the environment that we live in, but the kind of things that we do on a day-to-day basis with family or neighbors or colleagues, whatever. I think is often better explained using other principles than the ones offered by biology, or at least the ones I can offer.
Okay. So, I think I read this article you had written for Aeon magazine, Aeon, A-E-O-N. And here's a quote from that. He said, to Dawkins, the true achievement of Darwin was to show how a strictly mechanistic process, natural selection, caused the appearance of design in nature. Now, this was a very fascinating sentence for me, right? To cause the appearance of design in nature. Now, just allow me to complete the question, please. You can correct me wherever I'm going wrong here. But I thought that when you say appearance of design, it basically what you're trying to say is how nature looks like, And then when we say how nature looks like, are we limiting this design bit only to bioforms, living things? What about a rock? What about a mountain? They also have a shape. Then my bigger question became, as I started to think about it, can this process of natural selection, or rather the understanding of what natural selection we have gained from biology, be applied to all other sciences as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. So the kind of the appearance of design refers to this idea that if you look outside, if you look at plants and animals and so on, they look as if there was someone who created them, who designed them. And this is going to be an important part of certain faith traditions, where the idea that you can, by studying the natural world, you can make inferences about the divine world or about the creator. And this is a form of natural theology. In those traditions, people have often found it more helpful to study life animals than mountain chains and so on, because the idea is that animals have a kind of more clear, they show complex design in a way that a mountain does not. You can debate that, but I think that's kind of been a premise of a lot of those studies. I think when it comes to like how can the principles of evolution and natural selection apply to other forms, I think they can. I mean, the basic logic is very simple and abstract in a way. It applies to any kind of entities that varies in fitness somehow, however that is defined. And as long as that is heritable, whatever traits that are correlated with fitness, they will become more common over time. Now, you need some sort of mechanism of inheritance, or like that certain things can become more common over time. So there are a lot of it can apply to computer viruses as well as to viruses. If viruses can replicate and so on, and I think the logic holds for a lot of things. And I mean that's also part of why it is exciting, right? Because the theory is so simple in its at its core. The logic is so beautifully simple, but then the crux also often lies in the nuances of it. So
when my husband and I, when we were preparing for these conversations, we are now experts. I remember studying biology in school, and I loved it for the drawings. Everything else was so sharp and triangular and square. Here it had curves, and it had some indefinable beauty about it. But that was it. So now when I try to prepare for this, I do go through YouTube videos. That always helps. I read some papers which are not so utterly scientific that they just, where I do go is films, because films tell it like a story. And I do look at things like a story. That makes things easy for me to understand. But there is this film that came out. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Annihilation. Came out in 2018. Have you seen it?
I have not seen it.
Okay, it's a very interesting film. Here, it has many things in it. So the main character, she's a biologist at John Hopkins. So she's a biologist. And then what happens is they enter this place called the Shimmer, because this place has just transformed. Some kind of a mutation is happening, and no matter how much force and military they send inside to understand what's going on, nobody's coming out. So now they send a team of researchers, psychologists, biologists, a couple of these people. So this female, she's a biologist, she's talking to the psychologist who's a part of this all-female team who've gone inside. And before she went, her husband had gone in. And he came out in a very bad shape. He was like almost dead, the biologist's husband. So she asked the psychologist, who was the one who was profiling all these people who were going inside. She said, "You must have profiled my husband. Why do you think he went in for the suicide mission? This is a suicide mission." She said, the psychologist says, "You're a biologist. You're in a better position to say this, or the answer for this, because self-destruction is coded into us." Now it's a film. They take leaps of the imagination, and they get really creative about things. But do you think that this is so? Because she follows it up with examples like, why do you end up breaking a good job? Why do you end up breaking a good marriage? Why do these things happen? Because according to the psychologist, self-destruction is coded into us. They don't go any further. The biologist doesn't get to share her opinion on this. But do you have anything to say on this? Self-destruction being coded into us, yes or no? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it depends on what we mean by self destruction. It sounds like what the psychologists mean here is the kind of decision we make about our career and about relationships and other things that we imagine a future that could have been better, and that we did something to stop us from getting there. Probably, I think, or maybe Viola has something to say. But I don't know if I have anything to say on it. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, so you're saying from whatever your experience with your science has been, nothing like this at the genetic levels, at the genetic level, has yet revealed to be self-destructive, not willing to thrive, or just taking this whole system down, raging against the machine, we being the machine.
Yeah, so here it seems to mean that that it's bad for the individual. Like this person would have been better off had he not done this. You have things like when one form of defense against cancers is that cells that are nearby cancer cells kind of they self-destruct, in the sense that and by doing so they kind of take the cancer cells with them. Mm-hmm. This is you can think of this is good for the whole organism, and those for the good of the body. Is bad obviously for those cells as they die, but they kind of do so in order to help the rest of the body survive. So that's self-destructive on one level, at the cellular level, but it's obviously beneficial at the whole body level. But that sounds like something quite different from what this psychologist had in mind. And
yeah, okay. So in the same article that you wrote for the magazine, you also say that the selfish gene is a tool to explain adaptations. Dawkins argued that the best way to approach the issue was to pose the question: when we say that an adaptation is for the good of something, what is that something? Now, I thought, would it be interesting to shift the focus from something to good? So what if the question becomes, what is good? What would you say that, as per biology, is the best thing that can happen to a human being?
It's the best thing that can happen to a human being. I think it's going to be highly individual. I think there probably are some commonalities. I think a lot of us do. You thrive when you feel like you are in a social setting where people care for you, and you care for the people around you, where you can fill your days with something that feels valuable, whether that is work in the traditional sense or in caring for others. But then also have some time to do what you find fun. And I think kind of how those three things specifically are expressed, I think varies a lot from person to person, from culture to culture, or from different times in human history. But I think if you can do that, be in an environment where you love and feel loved, you spend your time devoting to something that feels important, but also have time to just do some things for your own enjoyment. I think whatever those can satisfy those three things will lead to a good life.
Yeah.
But that's more me as not necessarily as a biologist. It's like
No, I also share the same. I share it. I totally am with you on that. But once I started to think about it, I thought genetically it seems that the best thing that can happen to a human being is that they live as long as they can. Yes, happily. Yes, healthily. Would you say, like, because that's what genes also, to live longer. And the question that I was trying to frame, it became so complicated in my own head, but please bear with me as I try to find my way through this. So in today's world, when we say that we have extended the human life, we owe it to the success of medicine, right? We owe it to the success of medicine. But if the idea, whatever that I'm trying to say, that life should live long, the human life should thrive, although there are bacteria and all that, or some life forms that are born today and by the evening they're gone. But say if we stick only to human life, like if the fundamental goal is for each individual life to live as long as it can, then have we done something wrong in owing that success to medicine, instead of saying that, oh, naturally we should be living long only? Even though evolution, we are a part of evolution, and we are the ones through whom medicine has also come. So then I started to wonder, does the question still stand, what I'm trying to say?
Yes, we live much longer now. Important reason why the average lifespan has gone up is that a lot of babies don't die anymore, and that is a product of modern medicine, that we is better at delivering babies. This means that the baby survive, the mother survives. That is a part of modern medicine, as much as various drugs that can keep you alive when you are 85. And because I think sometimes when we say, I'm not saying that you said necessarily, but sometimes when we talk about like modern medicine extending life, we think of various drugs that keep you alive when you're very, very old.
Yeah.
But an important part also why the human lifespan has increased is people don't die young as much as they used to do. A lot of people died because of in childbirth or as very young children in diseases that we now have vaccines or treatments for. They live longer because kids get to go to school rather than work. They live longer because when you're a young adult, when you go to work, the workplaces are safer and so on. So I think there's a lot of parts to like why modern medicine has made us live longer. And I think generally that's been a good thing. And then you can have a discussion about like how much money we spend on certain life, things that extend lifespan for a small number of individuals versus ones that extend, kind of lifespan in general. But I mean, going back to your first point about, what life should the human live? Well, we clearly don't live a life where we just try to get as many offspring as possible, even though a kind of a naive prediction from evolutionary theory might be that that's what should be what we try to do, because clearly there are things that we value intrinsically that are beyond just producing more offspring. So there's like more than just kind of our evolutionary legacy in that way. And I think most find value beyond that, even though I think having a family is important to a lot of those, of course, not to everyone.
Okay. I think we can end with this one last question. What would you be able to comment on what Jean's view of life has to say about free will?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it feeds into that debate. I think free will is such a huge debate and depends on very much on what you mean by it. And I think, whether you, and the Jean's view has been caught up in kind of in an idea that it denies free will, in kind of being seen as a very deterministic form of free will. Perhaps what one should say is that, like, some of the biggest proponents of both free will have also been friends of the Jean's view. So Dan Dennett, for example, the American philosopher, who's written a lot, wrote the afterword for the extended phenotype, Richard Dawkins' second book, but also, and his own book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, is very much a kind of long defense of the Jean's view. But also is a defender of a certain kind of free will that is compatible with determinism and so on. So it is, again, one of those debates that, depending exactly what you mean, you can make the concept of the Jean's view compatible, incompatible with it. So yeah, we need to be, I think, specific about what we mean. But in principle, I think Dan Dennett's work is one of the best examples of that. You can certainly reconcile a Jean's view of evolution with a form of a kind of intellectually robust form of free will.
Interesting. So yeah, with that, we can conclude this conversation, Dr. Ågren, and I'd like to thank you once again for your time, for your insights, and for coming on the show. And we send you our best for all your work, your future work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and all the best with the future of the podcast.
My conversation with Dr. Ågren showed me how behaviors like conflict and cooperation, for instance, play out among genes, and that more often than not, cooperation is favored over conflict, with a mechanism in place to ensure just that. It also felt reassuring to know that our biology is sturdier than we realize, and for that, we should be grateful to modern science and life in general. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation, and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.